Hey friends, Seeking Our Spirit is back. This is Brett. Got to sit down with another new friend today. It was a great pleasure to meet and chat with Deacon Tim Elliott, speak about his spiritual life and journey. So I hope that you enjoy it as much as I did. As always, if you would like to recommend someone for the show, or if you would like to come on the show, or if you would like to inquire about spiritual direction with me, please contact me at seekingourspirit@gmail.com. And as always, thanks for the support, and we'll keep it going. Enjoy. Peace. All right, so we are rolling. Welcome, Deacon Tim Elliott. Good to have you with me this afternoon. Good to meet you, and thanks for coming and talking with someone who you don't know about spirituality, about your life. I really appreciate that, and I'm honored by that. Actually, we were talking a moment ago, so I was in high school in the same class with one of your children, so we're connected there a little bit. But why don't you, as we start, just tell folks who you are, what you do, that all just broad, bio stuff.
Okay, so I was born in Detroit, Michigan. It's a nice place to be from.
Yeah.
I've been, my wife and I moved with our kids to Tennessee right around 1986 type time frame.
Yeah.
And been settled here now for 36 years plus, and couldn't go back for most any reason.
Yeah. I shouldn't say "Go Pack Go" around you though. Still,
Say what?
I shouldn't say "Go Packers" around you though. Probably.
I don't care about those guys. They're okay. Nobody else cares about them either. My background, I come from a family. I've got 9 siblings.
Mm-hmm.
The oldest is a girl, and then there was 9 boys.
Wow.
I'm down near the bottom of the list.
Okay.
My sister is the oldest, and we span births from 1960 to 1940, or to 19, well, let's see. The youngest one it was born in 1960. My oldest sibling is 86 years old.
Yeah.
So there
Big
was
span.
just always a big house full, especially a house full of boys.
Yeah, for sure.
Everybody used to joke that we had our own baseball team, and we could whip anybody in the block. We were kind of the token Irish family in the Italian ghetto of Detroit.
Oh, okay.
And so as we were growing up, I had a great love for food.
Mm-hmm.
The food and the tastes and the smells of the neighborhood were just really kind of beautiful.
Awesome. Yeah.
Since then, I've learned to love the smell of pork butt on a grill, which is really quite comforting now.
Yeah.
My education background is in engineering, electrical engineering.
Okay.
I worked for the same company for about 45 years. They moved me from Detroit to down here.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started my own business in 1996, the year that my daughter was getting ready to graduate from high school. And I did that for about 15 years. Along the way through that process, I was ordained a deacon in 2007.
Mm-hmm. And that's in the Catholic Church?
In the Catholic Church. Born and raised in the Catholic Church. We refer to ourselves as cradle Catholics.
Yeah.
Probably baptized at the ripe age of about 1 week.
Yeah, sure.
And off we go.
Yeah.
So in terms of my background, my dad was he was in seminary to be a priest.
Oh, okay.
And was in there for about 6 years, and was home visiting one weekend, and he met my mom.
Yeah.
And things took an abrupt change.
Wow. Yeah.
Came out and had 10 of us.
Yeah.
Which is really pretty remarkable. So I grew up with a sense of really a deep spirituality within the home.
Yeah.
We lived in a place where right at the end of my street was my elementary school that was run by a group of Dominican nuns. Right next to it was a monastery with about 50 Benedictine monks that were all Italian. They were Sylvestrans. And so they came, the pastor of our parish where I grew up was the only one that spoke enough English to be a pastor to an Italian and Irish immigrant neighborhood.
Interesting.
I'll tell you a story about that too, I guess, because it was really, really interesting. He baptized me as a child, as an infant. And in 2001, when I was beginning to get my paperwork together to apply to the diaconate, I had to get a recent baptism certificate. And so I called the parish where I was baptized, and the secretary was the same secretary that was there when I was a kid.
No way.
And she says, "Just a second, Father Livius wants to talk to you."
What?
And so the same one that baptized me was still pastor at that church. And we kind of reminisced for a while. It was pretty cool.
You don't see that a lot, these days, folks hanging out that long. That's great. Wow.
It was beautiful.
Yeah.
So that connection was there. I've got kind of a blend, I guess, of spirituality between the Benedictine with that hospitality that comes with the Benedictine order. But I guess at my core, I'm more of what I call an Augustinian.
Okay.
I kind of came up through a very different path. In fact, when I told my mom that I was thinking about the diaconate, she says, "Of all my kids, you?"
Gee, thanks, Mom. Yeah.
Vote of confidence there.
Yeah.
But it was really quite interesting because I did take that path. And like Augustine, I like to claim that I had my years that I was a real hellion. And then found myself probably through the prayer and guidance of so many people that I met along the way, kind of channeling me, probably the most influential being my wife.
Yeah.
She was born and raised in Detroit as well. Actually, she was born in Canada, but then her parents moved to Detroit. And it's a kind of another funny story, but my brother and I married two sisters.
Oh, okay, yeah.
He got married first and set my wife and I up on a blind date, and here we are.
There you go. Yeah, nice.
I've got five children.
She didn't grow up in that same neighborhood area. Okay, yeah.
No, she was more in the downtown Dearborn area of Detroit. We have raised five kids. I have a daughter that lives in Texas with three of our grandchildren. I have two that live in Bristol, and I have one that lives here in Knoxville. Total of 9.5 grandchildren. We have one on the way.
Beautiful. Congrats.
Thank you. It'll be sometime in the early December, I guess, that one is born.
Okay.
It's been a very beautiful and full life with all of the kids hanging around.
Yeah, that's great. That's very wonderful. Nice. Well, let's thank you for that, and let's I guess sort of as we know, we're here to talk sort of about what do we mean when we say spirituality, and I love to look at that through the lens of people's sort of journey. So for you, Deacon Tim, before we touch that, you want to speak a little bit to audience about what a deacon is in the Catholic Church. I would assume probably fairly similar. I mean, we have deacons in the Episcopal Church, and our structures and systems aren't wildly different. But why don't you just say a little bit about that?
So a deacon in the Catholic Church is an ordained clergy. We have three levels of clergy in the church. We have deacons, priests, and bishops, very similar to the Episcopal Church. The deacon is called to a life of service. We are ordained, and our ordination, the sacrament of our ordination, configures us to Christ the servant.
Yeah.
Who came, we use the words, who came not to be served, but to serve. The foundations of that diaconate is in Acts chapter 6, where the apostles were carrying a lot of burdens and were having problems finding time to even study and talk with one another, evangelize. And so they asked the community to put forth 7 men filled with the Spirit, and they laid hands on them and set them to waiting tables for the Greek widows. My schooling, I went through a period of about 5.5 years of education for the diaconate. Very heavy 2.5 years of Scripture, the rest of it theology and practical experience. We can be found just about anywhere. During the Middle Ages, the diaconate as a standalone order kind of went out of, I don't know what the right word to use it, but they didn't ordain men just to be permanent deacons. They ordained them to be deacons to transition into the priesthood.
Right.
Fast forward to the Council of Trent, and the question of the reestablishment of the diaconate was on the agenda, but when it was discussed, they says, yeah, we're going to table that one. We're not, now's not the right time, which is probably a good thing. And then it was again on the agenda at the First Vatican Council in the mid-1800s, and that was interrupted by war before they could really decide on much of anything.
Right.
And then, so it came back up at the Second Vatican Council. And when I think about it, it was probably the most opportune time for it to come up, because the world was coming out of a period of many, many, many wars. And during the Second World War, there was a group of priests and bishops that were confined at Dachau together. They didn't want them mingling with a whole lot of other people, because they have a tendency to bring hope into dark places. And so they were trying to decide or talk about what could be done, what could the church do to bring a change about because of all of this violence and war.
Yeah.
And they almost unanimously in that setting said that we need to reestablish the permanent diaconate for men that are either married or not married, that can be in places where normal clergy could not be. On the factory floor, around a water cooler or a coffee pot in an office building.
Out in the world.
And our job was kind of defined to bring the neighborhood to the sanctuary, and then to turn around and bring the sanctuary back to the neighborhood. And so our roles liturgically are to proclaim the gospel, that prophetic role, to preach anywhere, and to actually bring Christ into the workplace in the most real sense that there is.
Yeah, very similar. I mean, I love to use the terms of like the diaconate is a bridge between the church and the world, and but back and forth, just as you described. And it's wonderful to know that the Catholic Church is has a healthy diaconate. I think in the Episcopal Church still struggle to establish that, and it's such an important role. And I didn't realize that history there, that final part. That's beautiful. So thanks for that. Okay, well, so with your life and sort of spiritual journey as you see it, you already sort of named a little bit of beginnings, just growing up steeped in Catholic culture and church and schools and having the Benedictines there and all. Where do you start? Like when you look back on life and think of relationship with God, spirituality, whatever we want to name that, where does that begin for you? Is it just has always been known because your family was just so steeped in that, or?
I think that I had a very sound beginning. Participated in everything church up until I was about 14 years old. Found a guitar at that point and turned into something that was completely foreign to my parents. And then kind of went on a journey trying to, through music, through lyric, of trying to establish who I was first as a person, outside and beyond this structure of church and family. When you come from a family that's that large, you have a tendency to strive for some kind of individualism.
Yeah.
So that you're not just, number 2, number 5,
right.
whatever. And people relate to you and say, "Oh, you're Ernie and May's son.
Yeah.
I knew your brother Richard. You're nothing like Richard."
Yeah.
And so you go through a period in your life where everybody wants to identify who you are by your family, by your surroundings, by your faith, by your religion. And I was just over it.
Yeah.
I wanted to,
identify yourself.
Right.
Yeah.
And it was during that time of the 60s. Anyway, I'm 71 years old. I kind of went through when 1963 came around, I was already 10 years old. And, was asking all the questions by the time Woodstock happened.
Nice.
And
Yeah.
that was just the way it was.
Yeah.
So becomes that journey came about through music, mostly, through a lot of anger, I think is another way of looking at it. And on a whim, one weekend, I was going to visit some friends in Holland, Michigan. Mm-hmm. And back then we used to hitchhike everywhere, and I was hitchhiking, and I was going through Grand Rapids, where my sister was assigned as a nun. She's a religious sister.
Yeah.
And I thought, I'll just stop in and say hi to her. And the next thing I knew, I was working in the hospital laundry at the hospital that she was at. And for about 2 years, went through a transformation, I guess, of rediscovering myself, but not in the typical role of the church, but in a role of service, a role of being actively involved with patients. I learned how to play my first cribbage game with a geriatric guy up on the 5th floor that was doing dialysis and needed to pass some time. Yeah. And so there was a lot of different opportunities that occurred during that period that were sort of formative.
Yeah. So you stayed up there for 2 years working. Okay. Wow. Interesting. What? So don't let me put words in your mouth. But so it sort of sounds to me like you were saying, like, grew up and steeped in this religious culture and context. But would it be fair to say that was sort of surface level in terms of your experience of it? And then music has been a huge part of my journey and still is. So I sort of want to know, like, you named that. What did that look like? Like, what music was taking you on that journey? What were you into?
Well, I played guitar. I picked up a guitar when I was about 10 years old. Mm-hmm. Had my first garage band when I was probably 12 or 13.
Yeah, nice.
I played all the way through into my early 20s, I guess, with a group. Very early, maybe I had turned 20.
What kind of stuff were you guys playing?
Well, it was kind of a mix. I started off with a lot of really good classic rock and roll, the Beatles especially, Rolling Stones, and then kind of went into Led Zeppelin, Jimi Hendrix.
Yes.
Delved into the blues an awful lot. Mm-hmm. And then kind of went through a shift and picked up an acoustic guitar instead of an electric guitar and started getting into a lot of the folk of the late 60s. Mm-hmm. Bob Dylan, of course, Arlo Guthrie.
Sure.
And playing, and I did a lot of small coffee houses around the Detroit area playing. Mm-hmm. So that was the kind of genre that I was in, and the last part being a lot more of a movement in my life because of the lyric was speaking so much to what was going on in the culture, social justice issues, There was a lot of unrest going on. There was some major riots in Detroit that occurred around that time as well.
Yeah, the music. So interesting because like folk, we associate with sort of calm, peaceful, but the lyrics, if you're really paying attention, were protest and were social commentary and yeah.
When I was in 8th grade, it was kind of a unique. We had a history class that I was taking in 8th grade. I went to a Catholic school all the way through 12th grade. But in 8th grade, we had a teacher. I still remember him to this day. His name was Mr. Wasak. And he was kind of an interesting guy to begin with. But he was teaching history, modern history, through a very different lens at the time. And so we would be reading about what was going on in France, for example, and he would introduce us to some of the philosophers of the time. So we were reading Voltaire, Montesquieu, John Locke, and looking at through
Interesting.
A historical lens through the lens of political philosophy at the time. My dad bought into that in a big way. He thought it was grand. My dad was a huge reader. We had a hallway in our house that was like this with just nothing but bookshelves. And we always did our homework around the dining room table. My dad would help us with math and science and those kind of things. My mom would help with English and art and whatever projects we had to do.
Yeah.
I guess typical for most families. And if we ever said we didn't have homework, my dad says, "Oh, yes, you do." And he would go to his library and he'd pull out a book and he'd say, "Read it, read this chapter or whatever." But that wasn't always enough because he'd read the book, and so he would begin to ask you questions to see what your comprehension was and what you thought about it. So reading became a big part of my life as well as music through those years as well.
What? Tell me, not to dwell too much on that aspect, but you mentioned anger in that journey with music. Was that in terms of that sort of social justice kind of?
I think it was a combination. It was anger at not being taken seriously for who I was, individually, apart from anything else, and also seeing what was going on in the world at the same time.
Okay.
So it was kind of a combination of both.
And then you mentioned, so you told the journey of going and seeing your sister and being up there, and that was a pivotal sort of moment in your life. What about that? Was it like, tell me more about that experience and what led to that transformation in you?
So my sister is a very unique individual. She is a religious sister of Mercy of Alma, Michigan. And she has a doctorate in Scripture from the Biblicum in Rome. She was the first woman to ever graduate through the Biblicum in Rome and get her doctorate.
Wow, awesome.
And she is also quite a theologian. And so at the hospital, there was a group of nuns that were there together. And when everybody else was running out and saying, "I'm going to, get rid of the habit, I'm going to join I'm going to get an apartment, I'm going to still be a nun, but I'm not going to look or act like a nun," type thing. She and this community said that they were staying together as a community, that one of the reasons that they became sisters was to live in community. And they were moving through the hospital promoting what was called healthcare for the body of Christ. And seeing through a religious lens a way of making an impact on ordinary people's lives. And what astounded me more than anything else, because growing up the way that I did, I had some very great misconceptions. But they never asked, "Are you Catholic?" before they would offer service. What is your belief system before they would offer service? And they would serve down. I'd see nuns that were doctors. There was a spill in the hallway, and instead of calling for the janitor, would just grab stuff and get down on their knees and start scrubbing the floors. They had a whole concept of service that was very different than the lens that I had seen.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, I love that for a lot of reasons. Just because I think, I don't know if you experience this, but I feel like often in my conversations with people, I guess it's just ignorance, but, people who are outside the Catholic Church have only one sort of perspective or view or taste of it. And really, as you're naming, there's really sort of a lot of different flavors that you can experience, depending on the setting. So I love that. I just personally too, I should name, half my family was German Catholic. We had German Catholic and German Lutheran all in Wisconsin, right? The Episcopalian came through the small sliver of an English Belgian grandmother who married my Catholic grandfather, and I always love to tell the story that our liturgies and our hierarchy and our many things about Episcopal and Catholic Church, obviously because of history, are very, very similar. But back then, my grandparents, when they dated, those were separate sides of town.
Absolutely.
And he would pretty much risk getting beat up going to date my Episcopalian grandmother, right? Like get across the bridge before dark, even in little Oshkosh, Wisconsin. But anyway, my whole point of that was just saying he on a very personal level, he was a beautifully devout Catholic man, and when that was a big influence in my spirituality in my life. So just naming that. Shout out to GPA Norm.
Well, one of the things that came about during that time is my sister, knowing how much I read, introduced me to St. Augustine with the Confessions to be the starting point, and then into De Trinitatis with his exposition on the Trinity. Mm-hmm. And it had a dramatic impact on me to see somebody that I felt was equally as angry about stuff. That was, Lord, make me chaste, but don't do it too fast. Right? Those kind of things going through life is, I really had an identity there that I could say, okay, I can see this. And then when he began to talk in terms of starting off on his exposition of the Trinity and starting from a statement that God is love, right out of the Gospel of John, and then immediately to make those connections between the lover, the beloved, and the love itself in the Trinity, really had an impact on me. Just to, instead of seeing God as something outside and remote, I saw God as a community of love.
Yeah.
And that kind of started me down a different type of spirituality.
Yeah.
Of being able to identify with that part of myself that was longing for that, as opposed to just going through the world kicking stones and being ticked off all the time.
Yeah, that's really cool. Because in me hearing this story, it's like you experiencing both through your sister and through that community, and then through Augustine, these different perspectives on relationship with God. Yeah, and Augustine's great. He's like bringing it down into earthy, right, into the lived experience. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wonderful. So those are pivotal experiences in your life at that time. Where do you go from there? Where does the journey take you?
Meeting my wife, pretty much set up by my brother and his fiance at the time, and then beginning to see the world through a lens that was something other than male. When you grow up, my sister was in the convent. In fact, she gave me my name, Timothy, and because she's now Sister Timothea, she gave me my name and then went to the convent in high school.
Yeah.
And so I basically grew up in a household that was 9 men, plus my mom and dad.
Yeah.
And so
it's a lot of testosterone.
It is, and how do you deal with things like disagreements in that environment? Well, you get a little bit of grass stain, you get a little bit of a split lip, and you pick yourself up and you carry on. Well, you don't do that with women, with girls.
Right.
And I had to learn once I got very serious with my wife that there's this whole different way of communicating, of making decisions, of collaboration, and things that, if you have a disagreement and you talk it out, you don't say, come on, let's go rumble in the yard.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a very different perspective that kind of pushes you forward. And then once we got married and started having kids, to see the level of service that she put into the family was just, in fact, I'm not shy about it. I tell people at church all the time when I preach everything I know about being a deacon I learned from my wife.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah.
Just that total giving of self into a community, in our case, into the family, is just a very beautiful, beautiful expression.
Yeah. And taken for granted, right, by many.
Absolutely true.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. I guess I'm sort of picking up on just a theme, though. I love, the thread running through your story of having these lived experiences and those being sort of a lens or a reflection for you of God's presence in your life.
Yes.
Yeah.
All of the big things that happened in my life, I think, gave me pause to step out of myself enough to say, okay, what's this all about and where's this going?
Yeah.
At the time that we were first married, I still wasn't the most, what I'd call, church-going Catholic that there was.
Yeah.
That came later, even. Kind of in a rebirth of sorts, I guess. During that period of time, raising kids, you begin to see things through a different lens as well, and that's the lens of 5 individual kids growing up, but knowing your background I want them to be individuals.
Mm-hmm.
How do you do that as a parent instead of saying, oh, this is my gang, You want to say, well, this is Kristen, this is Kevin, this is Brian, this is Noah, this is Nathan, and as you go through and experiencing the wonder that they bring from their age, because even though they're only 2 years apart, when we started having kids in 1978, technology in the world was changing at a rate that was phenomenal. So every 2 years, you had a different set of circumstances that you were trying to bring kids through.
Yeah.
And by the time they got to high school, it was even wider, that difference between each one of them. And so you begin to look at the world and your faith through more sets of eyes than just your own, constantly questioning what is the best path. And the best path always turns out that the one that they choose first.
Mm-hmm. Well, and sort of, so instead of parent trying to form and shape them to some sort of will or agenda, walking with them as they find that individuality that you were talking about. I guess is sort of what I'm seeing there. Yeah.
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 I like the word that you used, formed. So once I was ordained a deacon, first of all, maybe I need to explain that story a little bit.
Yeah.
So we were going to All Saints Church here in Knoxville. Father Chris Michelson was the pastor at the time. And we did not have a deacon program in the Diocese of Knoxville, which was all of East Tennessee. And they decided that they were going to start one. So they went to all of the pastors and they says, can you identify people in your community that might be on this road? And so he called me up one day out of the blue, and I come from a mindset of getting a call from the principal or the pastor.
Yeah, that ain't never good.
Yeah. So he says, hey, can you come on in and talk? And so I went in there kind of apprehensively, and he says, have you ever thought about being a deacon? And my first words to him were, well, what's a deacon?
Yeah.
Because we had one guy that I know of was in the diocese, was a deacon, but he was a transplant.
Right.
And I saw him at Sacred Heart, and he read the gospel with this beautiful voice, and that's all I knew about what a deacon was. So Father Chris began to talk about what a deacon was. And he says, "Do you think you might be interested?" And I says, "No." And he says, well, why not? And I said, "Well, my last child is in high school. We'll pretty soon be empty nesting. And I would really like to have the time to spend with maybe some travel and, with Pauline and all of this." And we talked, and I kind of dug my heels in and said pretty much, "No, I don't think so." And he says, "I'll tell you what, why don't you think about it, and I'll give you a call in a couple of weeks." I thought, okay, when I left, he's not going to call me because I already, said no. Well, 2-3 weeks later, phone call again, and he says, "Can you come on in?" And I says, "Is this about the same thing?" And he says, "Yes." And so I went in and I talked to him again, and the answer was, still, I just don't think so. And I says, "And besides, if it has to deal with celibacy, you're way too late." And he laughed, just, and he says, I'll tell you what," he says, "why don't you start the study? And at any time you want to, after a year, you can stand up and walk away. Up until the moment that you kneel in front of the bishop and promise obedience and he lays hands on you, you can get up and walk away, no more questions asked." So I said, okay, what have I got to lose? So I started the study. And it's a very intensive study, in our diocese especially, because we're so spread out.
Yeah.
And along the way, I found things that just kept tugging at me, and questions that I had, and things that were beginning to get answered. But the whole idea was, it wasn't a study, it was formation.
Yeah.
And shortly after I was ordained, they asked me if I would do the continuing formation for deacons. And that was in 2007. And we were without a bishop for almost 2.5 years. And when the new bishop came in, he says, "Oh, you're my deacon director." And I said, "Say what?" And so for the last number of years, 14 years, I just retired from that position with the diocese, but I was responsible for the formation, selection, assignment, continuing formation for deacons for the diocese.
Yeah.
We went from 29 that were in my class to 114 across East Tennessee.
Wow.
And this idea of formation is something that I experienced that I didn't have a name for, but it is what you give when you are looking at orders, when you're looking at being formed as a deacon or being formed as a priest.
Yeah. Really, really sort of beautiful, though. Again, I keep hitting on this image, but that is sort of a word you could use to describe all the things we've talked about so far. Like,
absolutely,
God sort of forming you slowly, right, through these experiences, through these lived experiences throughout your life. Yeah.
The 4 pillars of formation, I'm sure you probably know all about them. The human aspect, human formation, intellectual formation, pastoral formation, and spiritual formation. Those are the 4 basics that you work with people on. And you can give them an intellectual formation easier than you can do any of the other.
Oh, yeah.
Human formation, if you're just a bad person to start with, you're still going to be a bad person when you get done, unless you have this complete transformation go on in your life during that period of time. Spiritual formation is something that grows on you as your intellect begins to inform you of what's going on and what's real and what's truth. The pastoral part, some people are more pastoral than others. But again, a lot of that can be a learned experience through working as a chaplain in a hospital,
Yeah.
or any number of different things, counseling, those aspects of it. But there's certain things that you just can't get away from. And one of those is, what kind of a person are you? And how did you get to this place? And then using that as a way of forming all of those other aspects of their life moving forward.
Yeah, and that's vital, right? And I find, man, I don't know how prevalent even that beginning question is for our society, right? Like, how did I get here? What formed me so far, right? Analyzing and examining that, and thereby doing that, you sort of start to open up that conversation in general, you know. Would that sort of, do you feel like that sort of lays out most of your sort of spiritual timeline? I mean, that sort of brings you up to today. Are there any other like touch points throughout the story that you want to name?
So just after I was asked by Father Chris to become a deacon, we lost our oldest son. He was in a car wreck coming home from college. He was at Tennessee Tech, getting ready to graduate, and was coming home for the weekend. And somebody crossed the median on I-40, and he was killed instantly. And that was in the same context of going through all of the psychological evaluations that you go through before they say, yeah, you're psychologically okay to be a deacon, you know, or whatever. And I remember my wife and I both had to take all of this battery of psychologicals and everything, and it was within probably 3 to 4 weeks after his death.
Man.
And we went, took the tests, and then the counselor that was there doing the evaluation was also evaluating our marriage through different instruments that were going on. And she says, okay, sit down, you two, tell me what the heck's going on, because you just really boloed this test. So we explained it, and she just says, we got to throw it out. This isn't even valid at this point in time. They still let me continue, and eventually I got more of a psychological evaluation as time went on. But that experience alone really set me, I don't want to say it set me back, it set me very differently. Because immediately when you begin your programming, your formation as a deacon, you begin to pray the divine office. And so I would do morning prayer and evening prayer, and there was nothing there. You kind of go through a very empty feeling in your life. And as I was sitting there, I remember going through a period, I don't know how many months it lasted, that sleep was hard to come by. I'd wake up and I'd just be saying, okay, God, why? Why? And that's the unanswerable question, you know. And then one night I was sitting there all alone. It was probably 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And I had just finished reading Psalm 8, which is this, you know, oh God, look, you've made me little less than the angels, you know. What am I doing here? And so the question suddenly changed in my mind from why to so now what? And that subtle change really set me on a very different, that was probably one of the more pivotal changes that I went through. Because instead of saying, you know, you know, it was, okay, so what have you got in mind for me now? And then that formation then began to pack in around that and just change things completely.
What, I mean, maybe there's nothing more to say about that, but was that just a question, did they just pop into your mind that way, in that new way, or?
I think it came out of that psalm, why did you make me? You know? And given everything that's going on, so now what? You know, what do you want from me? That you made me this way, that you've given me this experience that I feel so inadequate to handle, to what am I supposed to do with it?
Yeah. Did you, I guess, what's, did you feel like you found the answer to that in that time, or?
It took a little bit of time, but it came about through that formation,
Yeah.
my own formation process, diving deeper into my own sense of spirituality, this bringing in Augustine that my sister had introduced to me, seeing this idea of what actually goes on in our Sunday services on a very deep and intense level, understanding, the whole sense of wanting to be deified ourselves through liturgy, through the sacraments. It just created kind of a cascade from that point on of asking questions, searching answers, growing spiritually, asking questions, getting answers, growing some more.
Thanks for sharing that. What, in terms of what you just laid out, asking questions, getting answers, growing more, do you have, sorry, I'm putting you on the spot and maybe these are hard questions or you can't recall these, but like, do you have like a couple big learnings from those processes that you hold on to still, or that were impactful?
There are some. One of those, it's going to be kind of a funny story, but it has an ending that is just really roots me very deeply. So when we moved to Tennessee, my daughter, my oldest, was in 4th grade. And she came home from school in early mid-spring, all excited. That she says, "Dad, we got to get in the car. We got to get in the car. You got to take me for a drive." And I says, "What are you talking about?" And she goes, "My teacher says we got to go out, and there's these arrows and things on the road that we just got to find them, and we got to travel around until we find them, and then we got to follow them."
What?
And I'm going, "What are you talking about?" And my neighbor overheard it and got a big smile and says, "She's talking about the dogwood trails."
Oh, okay.
So I'm driving around. I took her, put her in the car, and we're driving around, and I saw something that I had never seen before in my life. And that was a dogwood tree that had both red blossoms and pink blossoms on it.
Huh. Interesting.
And being an engineer, I'm always asking questions. So the first question that I asked is, how did that come to be? That's not normal. Well, the answer is through grafting.
Oh, yeah, sure.
So most of our food, the big avocados, all of that comes from grafting, right?
Yeah.
So what I found interesting is the process for grafting a dogwood tree like that. Is they take the stock of a Eastern Virginia dogwood, which is the white, and they take a dogwood tree from Japan, which has the pink flowers on it that are really pretty, and they literally cut a branch off of that tree.
Yeah.
And then they go down near the root and they make a cut into the rootstock, the hardy Virginia dogwood, and they shape the branch and they insert it into that tree. They nourish it, they bind it up, and if you did your job, the next spring you'll have a branch that has pink growing on a tree that has white.
Interesting.
And in that is baptism. Because in our baptism, we get grafted onto the body of Christ. Inseparable, physically and spiritually both. And that baptism, that nourishment is the nourishment of the sacraments, right? The binding up is, the mark of baptism can never be repeated. It's just this beautiful image of what happens, and then the flowing of the Spirit, bringing it to life, the vivification of that graft.
Yeah.
And so when I sit there and I look at an experience, it begins to become an explanation, and that explanation then is something that can be taught and experienced again. With other people in a context of forming others.
Yeah. I'm still so pulled. I don't want to be repetitive, but I'm still so pulled to like just how strong that posture or attitude that you're naming has been throughout your life. It's just fascinating.
Yeah, I think that we grow through our experience in the world.
Yeah.
That God put us here so that we could experience those things and so experience Him.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know that everybody though is looking at it that way and paying attention to when they have an experience to then examine it, read back into it, find the lessons, find the learning or the formation. So that's just, it comes through so strong in your story. It's interesting though to me because you really named like as your first moment of that as like going and being with your sister, you know? So that's fascinating. Or I sort of wonder if you've ever played with like, were you already approaching life in that way or not?
I think that we all experiment as a way of experiencing things. You experiment in your music, and so you begin to explore what that music looks to you like. You know, a different way of playing a chord, or a different way of tuning a guitar, or a change in rhythm, or a change in melody, or whatever. And that's just an example, but it applies across the board.
Sure.
And as you begin that experiment, certain things shake out, and those things that shake out are the important things that you remember. That sounded good. That wasn't so good.
Yeah.
You know. And so you put those bumpers up on your experience. Most people put those bumpers up of that was good, that one wasn't so good.
Yeah.
That was good, that wasn't so good.
That caused pain in
That's
life.
Right. And even out of the ones that cause some pain, you know, or the not so good experiences, you get a revelation of some form that affects what you're doing with everything else. So, you know, that's not so good. I don't want to incorporate that in the music, but, you know, that little tonal quality that I got, you know, I could add that, but not as the main piece.
Yeah.
And so it begins to color that experience that you put out from that.
Yeah. You're reminding me, I guess in some ways I sort of describe parts of my life in a similar way, right? That, you know, I did some wild things, ran around with a wild crowd, did things that you would say, that didn't sound so good, you know, but would never delete those, or I don't regret that because it gave me those experiences.
Right. It moved you on to something different that incorporated that experience and allowed you to function better moving forward.
Yeah, in fact, I deeply value those times and those experiences,
Especially if you get a chance to unpack them later in life with somebody that experienced them with you.
Yeah.
Like sitting down with my mom or my dad later in life when I says, "Oh, Mom, I'm going to be a deacon." She said, "Of all my kids, you?"
Yeah.
And then that just launched us into, well, let's talk about these experiences that you've had that have, you know, why do you think you're where you're at? And you begin to unpack it, but you unpack it under an eye that saw it as well. And so you get a certain amount of affirmation, but you also get a certain amount of challenge out of that type of an experience.
So I'm trying to be conscious of your time today too. Is there any other, because I've got my sort of the question I ask everybody looming, is there any other touch point or important part of Deacon Tim's spiritual journey that you haven't named yet?
One other part that's come about, and this has been more recently, I mentioned that I was director of deacons for all of these years, and finally moving into retirement, and said it's time for somebody else to take that.
You never got a whole bunch of that travel and downtime, did you?
No, I didn't. So, but there was a point in time a few years ago that I remember again, one of our commitments or promises is to pray the Liturgy of the Hours, morning prayer and evening prayer every day. And I was finding that my time everything was a time suck. I mean, I would hit the road running first thing in the morning, and I'd be late at night and doing something at the parish or doing something with formation of deacons.
Burning it on both ends.
And I remember one night, it must have been about midnight, and I just says, God, I don't even have time to pray anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the Holy Spirit, your guardian angel, whatever you want to call it, from that moment on, woke me up at about 5 or 5:30 every morning without an alarm. And said, it's prayer time.
Oh.
And so I have...
Not the answer I was looking for, yeah.
That's right. I now have at least a full hour to an hour and a half in the morning when I wake up, that the first thing I do is grab my cup of warm coffee, and I sit down and I go through that process of morning prayer. And I do a deep dive in terms of a practice called Lectio Divina, of looking at Scripture, reading it, what stands out, meditating on it, and then how do I incorporate that in my day?
Yeah.
And so I do that with the Liturgy of the Hours, because there's Psalms, there's a canticle, there's a reading from Scripture, and you go through all of that, and the next thing you know, you're in this very quiet place, but it can be very, very challenging at the same time. And so that practice has really, in the last few years, just really pushed me in a direction much more deeply spiritual.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I love Lectio Divina. It's been a practice of mine for a long time as well, and love sharing it with people and trying to help them put that tool in their tool chest. Yeah.
And I think sharing that with guys that are in formation to be deacons and watching and guiding that formation process with them, respecting their individuality, and seeing the very beautiful manifestations of each person's spirituality as they begin to grow through this 5-year process is pretty incredible as well. And you can't help. It's kind of like, brushing up against a plant that's got heavy pollen on it, and you walk away and you got an orange smear on your leg. You can't help but have that stuff, that dust fall on you as you're going through time.
Good stuff. So I think I prepped you for this a little bit. Hopefully, I'm not putting you on the spot again. But so, as a way of sort of wrapping up conversations, I love to ask people, however you define this, like what it can be one event, it can be, if you have a couple, whatever. But when you look back at just this whole journey that you've been talking about and laying out, and maybe you've already named this, but what would you point to as your sort of standout, most significant or powerful, meaningful, quote unquote, spiritual experience or experience of God?
So to kind of name that would be to say that it's only one. Are there those moments? Yes, there's those moments. I mentioned my son and that change in thought of why to what's next. But I think you understand first that there is a God by just opening your eyes from the moment you're born and seeing what's in the world that has been given to you as gift. And learning to say thank you. And I think that is probably the first lesson, and the lesson that lasts the longest is to be able to sit and say thank you.
Yeah. Eckhart, the only prayer you ever say is thank you.
Yeah. And I think that's probably when I learned the power of thanks and saw it as kind of a guide for so much that I've been through in my life. Thanks for giving me fingers that I can pluck strings, Thanks for giving me a mind that I can read. Thanks for giving me eyes that I can see the beauty that you've created in this world. That thanksgiving, I think, is more powerful, and it leads us to a place of conversation through the Spirit. I think that thankfulness is a mechanism to get us into conversation one-on-one with God.
Oh yeah, I mean to have and hold and live through a perspective or a lens of gratitude. Then what isn't spiritual, right?
That's right. Absolutely true.
Yeah.
And the many friends that you pick up along the way. You did one of these with Melanie, very, very good close friend.
Yeah, I should have said thanks to Melanie for connecting us.
She is a wonderful, beautiful person.
Yeah.
And she's got a sense of spirituality too. That is, we're all unique in what that looks like, what that lens looks like. So you're going to have material for this podcast for a very long time.
Yeah, well, good. Yeah, awesome. Well, I appreciate, once again, I'm always just thrilled and honored to be able to sit with somebody who's brave enough to talk with a guy they don't know and share these things. I thank you for spending time with me and sharing your story. And anything else you want to say to the folks who listen or plug or anything?
The one thing that I'll say is pick yourself up, give thanks to God for the day that He's given you, and then make the most of the day to show that you're really thankful.
Yeah, beautiful. That's a good way to wrap up. So, Deacon Tim, pleasure to meet you. I think we've probably crossed paths at some time in my younger life, but good to meet you and see you again. And maybe we'll do it again sometime.
I'd be happy to.
Awesome.
Thanks.
All right. Blessings. Take care.
Bye.